Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everybody, and Happy New Year to everybody in Budapest. And fortunately, I've just been able to confirm that we'll be coming to Budapest early in 2025, so I hope I see many of you in person at that time. This has been a terrible year from the point of view of geopolitics. It has been a terrible U.S. administration. I think the Biden administration has been about the worst of our modern times. It has been a terrible European Union Commission, I'm sorry to say. And we have the very high unpredictability looking forward. So we are with three major crisis zones in the world. There are many beyond that, but three that pit the major powers against each other. Of course, the war in Ukraine is a war between the United States and Russia. The war in the Middle East is a war of the U.S. and Israel on much of the Arab world. And the tension in East Asia is a growing risk of conflict between the United States and China. In all three of these areas, diplomacy could have prevented the conflicts. Diplomacy is needed to end the conflicts. Whether we have diplomacy or not remains to be seen. In the case of the Ukraine war, this is a war of NATO enlargement, plain and simple. Prime Minister Orban and Prime Minister Fico are the only two leaders in Europe that understand this accurately. This is a war that was provoked by the United States, not by Russia. It was a long-term plan of the United States to expand NATO and with the specific objective of surrounding Russia in the Black Sea with NATO countries, with the idea that Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia would all surround Russia's Black Sea fleet and basically render Russia a has-been on the world scene. And this was all spelled out very clearly by U.S. strategists in the 1990s, and it has played out since then. The war came because of this, and because the United States refused to recognize Russia's legitimate security interests of not having NATO on its borders, not being surrounded by NATO countries, especially since in 1990, the United States and Germany said in unequivocal terms that NATO would not enlarge 1 inch eastward, much less all the way to the Caucasus. So the U.S. caused this. It should not have overthrown Yanukovych in 2014. It should have negotiated with Russia in 2021. It should have allowed Ukraine to declare neutrality in 2022. But it did none of those things, because the U.S. deep state is, to this day, intent on defeating Russia and expanding the U.S. Military power as far and wide as it wants. And this is, Biden has been part of that, and that's why he has been one of our worst presidents in modern history. The second crisis in the Middle East is a crisis that has come for a very basic, unworthy reason as well, which is that Israel conquered Palestinian land in 1967, and it decided to keep that land and to rule over the Palestinians in an apartheid state. And Netanyahu is very clear about this. Israel will never retreat from the Palestinian lands. If the Palestinians don't want to be ruled by Israel, they should leave. This is as simple as that. Netanyahu recognized 30 years ago that this would lead to resistance, This would lead to military resistance by Hamas and Hezbollah and others. And Netanyahu's strategy, spelled out already in 1996, is instead of fighting Hamas and Hezbollah, Israel should fight the countries that back Hamas and Hezbollah. And in 2001, a famous list of 7 countries was drawn up that the United States would overthrow in 5 years. And this list included Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Somalia, Sudan, and Libya. And interestingly, the United States has gone to war with 6 out of these 7 countries. The United States has backed Israel's war against Lebanon. The United States has been directly involved through the CIA in Syria since 2011. The United States invaded Iraq. The United States invaded Libya. The United States backed proxy fighters in Somalia and Sudan. And the one country that the United States has not directly attacked is Iran. But Netanyahu wants the U.S. to escalate to go to war with Iran as well. So I regard the Middle East wars, including the fall of Syria last week, as a plan that has been underway for 30 years to remake the Middle East in Israel's image and to have the United States carry the heavy lifting of that. The result is a disaster. It's basically the destruction of Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, and Sudan, all of which remain battlefields until this day. And this was the plan. I mean, the plan was that these would be functioning U.S.-backed states, but none of them is functional. And Syria is very unlikely to be functional as well. It's more likely to fall into civil war than to be a functional state. The third crisis is in East Asia. And this is America's struggle to remain the hegemonic power despite the rise of China. Now, it's impossible for the United States to be the hegemonic power of East Asia because China is larger and more powerful in East Asia. The United States is trying to harm China's economy through tariffs, through prohibitions of technology, through general info wars, through instructions to its companies not to invest in China, through formulating trade agreements that exclude China. And, of course, the United States is trying to surround China with U.S. military bases in Japan, in Korea, in Australia, and in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. This is a doomed course. China will not be contained. China will not succumb to U.S. pressure. And if worse were to happen, the U.S. and China will go to war, perhaps over Taiwan. This is U.S. madness. The U.S. cannot defeat China in a war in East Asia, of course not. But the war could either turn into a world war or an outright military defeat of the United States. I don't know which it would be, but it would be a complete disaster. So these are the main crisis zones in the world. As you hear, my own view is the United States is the faulty party in all 3 cases, basically reflecting the delusions of unipolarity or the delusions of hegemony, which I think is a kind of arrogance that is way past its time and is getting us into a lot of trouble. My own hope for 2025 is that the U.S. changes its foreign policy, that all 3 of these crises should be diffused straightforwardly. How could that happen? 3 ways. First, the United States could stop NATO enlargement, and that would end the war in Ukraine. Second, the United States could back a state of Palestine, and that would end the war in the Middle East. Third, the United States could acknowledge that Taiwan is clearly a part of China, and the United States would stop sending armaments to Taiwan, and that would end the tensions with China. Do I count on any of this? Maybe Trump will end the war in Ukraine. I doubt that he will recognize the state of Palestine, and I doubt that he will tamp down tensions with China, though it is possible that he would do something more on that. He will launch a trade war with China for sure. Whether he launches a hot war or a rising escalation with China over Taiwan remains to be seen. So I can't give you a forecast because we're going to have one of the most unpredictable administrations in our history. I can only give you a prescription, and the prescription is peace, peace, and peace in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and in East Asia by the United States changing its foreign policy approach and accepting the reality of multipolarity. The final thing I want to say is that European foreign policy is absolutely bizarre and dreadful. Europe mortgaged its future to NATO, which is completely unjustified and not in Europe's interest. Van der Leyen doesn't know whether she is an employee of the United States or actually the head of the European Union Commission. Kaja Kallas is as likely to create a war with Russia as she is to find a diplomatic way, because the rhetoric that comes out of the new High Representative for Europe is absolutely destabilizing. Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, is already showing completely adverse views that Europe now has to go to 3% of GDP, that it's all getting ready for war with Russia for no reason, because what Europe needs to do is to understand collective security, that Russia has real security interests, that the United States is provocative and needs to stop provoking, and Europe's real solution, but maybe too late, never too late, Europe's real solution should be the OSCE, which is a body of 47 countries based on collective security, not on NATO, not on blocs, not on security for some at the expense of others, but on collective security. So these are the remarks that I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your insights, Professor, and thank you for taking the time to join us. We'll have a lot to reflect on, but we'll let you go. Thank you again, and have a pleasant day ahead.